Thank you guys for joining. We're going to start momentarily, but I just want to let you know in advance, and I'll remind you later how to ask questions. There is a Q&A button that you should see, and you can click it and then send us a question, and we will read them later on towards the end, but we'll give you another reminder right before we're about to ask questions. Okay, I think we should get started. David, if you want to take it away and just, play from slide.
Great. So thank you all for joining us. My name is David Halperin. I'm the Executive Director of Israel Policy Forum, and I'm joined today by Michael Koplow, our Policy Director. And today we'd like to provide an overview presentation on the issue that has been discussed a great deal, certainly by our organization, but is now very much in the discourse and dialogue in the political the conversations of the moment inside Israel, and that's the issue of West Bank annexation. What we'd like to do today is provide an overview of what does this mean? What exactly do we mean by West Bank annexation? What are exactly the ramifications? What are the basics? What should we know? And much of the research that we will present today is based on research conducted by our partners in Israel, the Commanders for Israel Security. But we're going to present it today not only through the security lens, but also from the lens of advocates for in the United States, within the American Jewish community, recognizing that the ramifications of West Bank annexation are not ramifications that are issues that Israel will have to deal with alone, but will impact the U.S.-Israel relationship, the ways in which American Jews relate to Israel, the fight against BDS, and more. Throughout the presentation today, we will provide maps, various slides, play a few videos. We're going to welcome questions throughout by the chat function, but we expect that we'll get through much of the material in about 20-25 minutes, in which case we'll encourage any and all questions going forward. So Michael, should we just get right to it?
Yeah, let's get going.
All right, so thank you all for joining. I think we should start by understanding the basics of the West Bank. What is the reality today? And I'm going to play a brief video that we've put together that outlines it.
The Oslo Accords of the 1990s divided the West Bank into three areas, A, B, and C, segmenting out different levels of Israeli and Palestinian control over the territory. Area A, 18% of the West Bank, is under the full political and security control of the Palestinian Authority, a transitional body set up to govern the area. This is where the major Palestinian cities are located. Area B, 22% of the West Bank, is under Palestinian civil control and joint Israeli-Palestinian security control. Together, areas A and B are home to 2.3 million Palestinians. Area C is the remaining 60% of the West Bank, which is under full Israeli civil and military control. This is where Jewish settlements are located and where approximately 300,000 Palestinians live. It is also the area that most annexationists claim to want to absorb. But Area C is the only contiguous territory of the three Oslo areas. As you can see from the map, annexing Area C alone would leave 169 disconnected enclaves of Area A and B.
And again, this is the situation as it is today with the three areas. Michael, I wonder if you want to speak a little bit about the situation as it is today, or particular Area C, or have anything before we move on.
Sure. So, I think that video laid it out pretty well. When it's important to understand, and you can see it from looking at this map, that again, A, B, and C are not these very easily separatable, distinct territories. I think that most people, when they hear Area A, Area B, and Area C, they tend to think of them as three circles, three triangles. And particularly when you know that the Palestinians are in areas A and B for the most part, and that Area C contains all the Jews in the West Bank, it makes it sound as if you can divide these things up very easily. But as you can see from this map right in front of us, where Area C is all of the white part, Area C is really like a spider web. If you take a spider web and you put it down on a table, Area C is the web, and areas A and B are all the empty spots in between the web. And so when we talk about annexing areas in the West Bank, it's important to understand what that looks like. And particularly when somebody says, Area C, that's where the Israelis are, we can easily annex that. Understand that it means annexing literally a spider web that creates these 169 different enclaves in the middle of it. And the first question of that always has to be, how does that actually even happen in practice? And how do you secure it? How do you administer it? And how do you deal with it?
That's right. So let's talk about what the process of annexation could lead to, and really the core of what we will present and talk about today. Starting from the moment of where we are in creeping annexation, we'll speak a little bit about legislated annexation, what that means, and then what this path could be to a one-state outcome, which would lead to a binational state, and the end of what the vision is of our organization, a secure Jewish and democratic state, and why we are raising such alarm. So Michael, I'm going to continue the slide, but I'll let you touch on the issues starting with creeping annexation per PowerPoint.
So when people talk about creeping annexation, what they're generally referring to are efforts on the part of the Israeli government to really further Israeli control and spread an Israeli presence in the West Bank outside of areas that are presumed to be kept by Israel in any deal with the Palestinians. So in every negotiation with the Palestinians, it has been based on this notion that Israel will end up keeping some part of the West Bank, the part that contains the large settlement blocks, and that there will be land swaps back to the Palestinians in return for the parts of the West Bank that Israel will keep. And generally, when you're talking about land swaps, you're talking about Israel keeping anywhere from 3 to 5% of the West Bank and swapping an equivalent 3 to 5% of land currently in Israel to the Palestinians for a Palestinian state. Creeping annexation refers to the expansion of Israel's presence outside of this 3 to 5% of the land. And so it can mean things like settlement expansion outside of the blocks. And as you can see from this slide, when Prime Minister Netanyahu first took office during this current stretch, most of the construction inside of the West Bank was in these blocks. And almost a decade later, it is now the case that the majority of construction is taking place outside of the blocks. And so that can mean anything from more isolated settlements to settlements that are actually illegal under Israeli law, the hilltop settlements that are built without Israeli permits or on private Palestinian land. It also means efforts to legalize all the settlements in the West Bank that are illegal under Israeli law, or in some cases, and this we can get to this, but there's been talk about this in the context of possible leaks of the Trump peace plan, talking about applying Israeli sovereignty to all the settlements anywhere in the West Bank, not just ones that are in these settlement blocks. And so creeping annexation really refers to all of these efforts to extend Israel's presence throughout the West Bank into areas that presumably would not be part of Israel after a permanent status agreement with the Palestinians. And the problem with creeping annexation, it's really twofold. One is that if you want to get to an eventual two-state solution with the Palestinians, it makes it much, much harder to do that when you have to unwind these things that are taking place outside of the blocks. You're talking about a situation where you're putting more Israelis and more Israeli construction into places that presumably will not be part of Israel at the end of the day. And that means coming up with a way of dealing with that, whether it means having to evacuate more people or come up with some way to have those people live inside of a state of Palestine. That's one problem. The other problem is that when you're talking about whether Israel is serious about getting to two states, it makes it a lot harder to take those claims at face value if the thrust of what Israel is doing is to actually make it harder to get to two states. And these various things that fit under the rubric of creeping annexation certainly make it more difficult to get to a two-state solution.
Right, and I think on the issue of the legal foundation, here it's really about various efforts to increasingly undermine the strength of the Supreme Court, which could strike down various legislative efforts to address annexation as well. And that brings us to the current state on the ground, where Palestinians have an incredibly difficult time getting any permits at all, and the establishment of these facts on the ground, as you were mentioning.
Right. So to just quickly talk about permits in Area C. So Area C, as we saw in that video and in that first map, Area C is under full Israeli administrative control. So if you are building in Area C, obviously if you're an Israeli, but also if you're a Palestinian, you are going to Israel, not to the Palestinian Authority for building permits. And it is almost impossible for a Palestinian to get a permit to build in Area C. When I say almost impossible, in 2014, 15, and 16, across those 3 years, there was exactly one permit granted by the Israeli government to Palestinians to build in Area C. And so, you have this problem of Area C being 60% of the West Bank. And remember, only 3 to 5% of that is presumably going to be kept by Israel in any peace deal. But you have 60% of the West Bank that is now effectively off limits to Palestinians to build homes in any sort of legal manner because they are not granted permits. And what happens is Palestinians, because there are 300,000 of them in Area C, they build anyway, and those houses all get put under demolition orders. And obviously it's a huge security problem to have all of these Palestinians living under the imminent threat of having their homes demolished. It also doesn't exactly do wonders for Israeli PR. A lot of the stories that have been in the news over the last year have been about potential demolitions of either Palestinian towns or Bedouin towns in Area C that were built without permits. But again, they're built without permits because permits are literally impossible to come by. And then when we quickly talk about roads and infrastructure, much of the thrust of the building in the West Bank has been outside of the blocks and spending literally billions of shekel on roads and infrastructure well outside of the blocks. And again, it leads to this question as to what Israel's ultimate intentions are, because if you're talking about a government that is serious about eventually getting to two states and ceding 96% of the West Bank to the Palestinians for a future state, it seems odd to be spending billions of shekels building roads and tunnels and all sorts of infrastructure deep into the West Bank that is outside of that 3 to 5% of the land that Israel will presumably keep in a land swap.
So that's right, and I think we have a good video to present that demonstrates this quite well from something that was played on Channel 12 News, and I'm sorry, I just skipped over it. One moment. Here we go.
מבחינת ממשלת ישראל, גם אם לא מצהירים על כך בגלוי, נדמה שהפור נפל, הסיפוח כבר כאן. ואין הוכחה ברורה יותר מאשר הכסף. לפני שנה בדיוק הוחלט על תוכנית לשיפור התשתיות מעבר לקו הירוק. העלות 5 מיליארד שקלים. אחד היעדים המרכזיים הוא שיפור הכבישים, למשל הכביש הזה, שבו אנחנו עומדים בלב חווארה, כביש 60. התכנון לבנות את עוקף חווארה, עלות שיפוץ הכביש היא 850 מיליון שקלים. הכוונה היא לבנות מחלפים, מנהרות, כבישים עוקפים, ומי שמשקיע כאלו סכומים לא מתכוון כנראה לצאת מכאן לעולם. וכך זה נראה בשטח. כביש האורך של יהודה ושומרון עובר מתיחת פנים אמיתית. נסיעה בעוקף רמאללה תגלה דחפורים עובדים, מנהרות שנחפרות. ארץ גיבורי התנ"ך משתדרת.
So it really encapsulates what Michael, you were just mentioning in terms of the investment and the no intention of leaving. I think when we think about the process of where we are, this is really the spot where we are on this roadmap to a roadmap to one state. And so thinking about where we go from here, we have to recognize the growing support for taking the next step beyond creeping annexation.
אנחנו נכיל ריבונות, לא בזכות הכוח, אלא בכוח הזכות.
וכן, אפילו כאשר אנחנו מדברים על סיפוח חד צדדי של שטחי C.
עכשיו אנחנו צריכים לממש, כי אין לנו ברירה. הריבונות חייבת להיות על כל חלקי מדינת ישראל, ביהודה, בשומרון, בירושלים, בבנימין, בכל הארץ הזאת.
חברי ליכוד יקרים, העולם הזה נוהג ואומר כולו, הליכוד בעד ריבונות. הליכוד תומך ברעיון החלת הריבונות על יהודה ושומרון.
אני חושב שהכנסת הבאה יש לנו משימה גדולה, החלת הריבונות על ההתיישבות היהודית ביהודה ושומרון. רק לפני כמה שנים כל מי שדיבר על הנושא הזה נתפס כהזוי לגמרי. אנחנו הפכנו את זה בשנים האחרונות למה שמכונה בלועזית מיינסטרים, לשיח המרכזי בחברה הישראלית, ואני מקווה מאוד שאחרי שגם מרכז הליכוד קיבל החלטה ברוח דומה, אנחנו בכנסת הבאה נצליח גם ליישם.
על סיפוח של יהודה ושומרון? אני בעד סיפוח של יהודה ושומרון. של מה? של מה בעוד כל יהודה ושומרון? כל יהודה ושומרון. כולל שטחי A ו-B? כל יהודה ושומרון.
So, look, our focus on this is really to demonstrate just how widespread the growing support for some form of annexation is. It is not something, as I think you saw Yulia Edelstein said, it was once considered to be crazy. It has now entered the political mainstream, and that's what's so concerning about this moment. And I think we should now turn into what some of those specific proposals are. And I think when we talk about annexation, it doesn't all mean the entirety of the West Bank. There are some efforts at partial annexation. And Michael, I know you wrote about this about a week or so ago, about the dangers of partial annexation, but this is one that we can take as an example of Ma'ale Adumim, something that is widely in the Israeli consensus to be considered part of Israel, and in any final arrangement, agreement with the Palestinians. I think there are few, if any, Israelis who seriously think Ma'ale Adumim will not be part of Israel. But of course, the challenge is, what is the border? And the border is ultimately set for negotiations. And if you look at the map on the right, you can see the built-up area in blue of Ma'ale Adumim, but the district, which includes E1. E1, the long-standing red line for the Europeans, that a deeply controversial and problematic area in the way in which it bisects a future Palestinian state north to south. But Michael, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what partial annexation is and why it's problematic.
Sure. And by the way, I would add that E1 wasn't just a problem for the Europeans. It was a red line for the George W. Bush administration as well. For anybody on this webinar, if you've ever gone to E1, and you can, it's right opposite Ma'ale Adumim, you can drive right up there. It looks like a town where all the houses were raptured. and that there are roads and utility poles, and it's literally and a giant police station at the top. It's literally a fully developed settlement without any houses, because the Bush administration told Prime Minister Sharon that there would be serious problems from the U.S. if any houses were actually built, and so it's basically all sitting there ready to be developed with all the infrastructure, just no actual houses. So partial annexation refers to not annexing all of the West Bank, but annexing parts of it. And the domino that's likely to fall first, and I think that after a government is formed in the next couple of weeks, we're probably 6 to 12 months away from a Ma'ale Adumim annexation bill. This is going to be the first domino to fall. And as David said, it's because Ma'ale Adumim is the third largest settlement in the West Bank. It is right next to Jerusalem. Pretty much all Israeli Jews view it as well within the Israeli consensus. When you're talking about land swaps, it's probably literally the first thing that would be kept by Israel in any land swap. And so this notion of annexing Ma'ale Adumim, frankly, it's not very controversial. I think that most Israelis, even ones who say they oppose annexation and they support two states, and that includes the members of the current opposition. If you say annexing Ma'ale Adumim, I think most of them will say, oh, what's the big deal? It doesn't affect it doesn't absorb any Palestinians. It's really basically Jerusalem anyway. It doesn't actually negatively impact anything, and so what's the problem? And the problem is that, sure, if you annex Ma'ale Adumim and you cut it off there and go no further, wouldn't be the biggest deal in the world. The problem comes in that once you do Ma'ale Adumim, it makes it very easy to take the next step and then annex Gush Etzion. And once you've done that, it makes it very easy to take the next step and annex Ariel. And once you've done that, it makes it easy to take the next step and say, well, at this point, let's just apply sovereignty to all of the settlements and take all of Area C. And so, Ma'ale Adumim can't be looked at as as something that's done in a vacuum. It has to be seen as the first step in a process. And in fact, when folks on the Israeli right who talk about annexation, when they talk about how it will be carried out, they talk about it as part of a multi-step process, with Ma'ale Adumim being the first step in that process.
Right, and I think it's important to note, we'll come back to this idea of the slippery slope and I think explain it a bit further, but it's also important to note that even Benjamin Netanyahu in his pre-election comments about annexation by no means was limiting his support of annexation to just Ma'ale Adumim, and we can of course play this video of what we should all have seen by now.
אני לא אעקור אף יישוב, ואני כמובן אדאג שאנחנו נשלוט בשטח ממערב לירדן. עכשיו, השאלה עכשיו שאת שואלת היא שאלה מעניינת, האם נעבור לשלב הבא? והתשובה היא כן. נעבור לשלב הבא.
זאת אומרת שבקדנציה הבאה שלך אתה מכיל ריבונות ואתה מספח את גושי ההתיישבות?
אני הולך להכיל ריבונות, אבל אני לא מבדיל בין גושי ההתיישבות לנקודות היישוב הבודדות. משום שמבחינתי כל נקודת יישוב כזאת היא ישראלית, יש לנו אחריות כממשלת ישראל, אני לא עוקר אף אחד, ואני לא אעביר...
So again, we're talking about clearly not a distinction between blocks and beyond, and partly that's because he recognized the political reality of now forming a government, which he is now in the process of doing, with many of elements that are actually actively supporting the idea of applying a sovereignty of annexing major portions of the West Bank and are not satisfied with merely the blocks. And I wonder, Michael, if you could speak about this moment that we find ourselves in amidst the negotiations and annexation.
So obviously negotiations are going on right now to form a coalition, and some of the prospective parties in the coalition, most prominently the Union of Right-Wing Parties, which is the union between the Jewish Home Party, the Tekuma Party, and the Otzma Yehudit Jewish Power Party. The thing at the very top of their list of demands in order to join the coalition is for the government to begin annexing the West Bank. Now, for the Union of Right-Wing Parties, they want the annexation of the entire West Bank. But what they're asking for is a commitment to start this process in some way, shape, or form. And I think it's also important to note, because it's easy to dismiss this if you say, well, the annexationists were Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked, and they didn't make the government, and the Union of Right-Wing Parties, those are the Kahanists, they're pretty outside the mainstream. Recall the video that we played a couple of minutes ago of all of those people talking about their support for annexation. Every single one of the people in that video was a Likud MK, Likud, the biggest party in the Knesset and the leading party of the government. So this isn't limited. This isn't an issue of a far right party pushing the government to do something that it doesn't want to do. Every single Likud MK who was up for re-election last time, including ultimately the prime minister, as you saw in that interview, supported publicly some form of annexation in the West Bank. And I think that it's been easy in the past to say this won't happen. The prime minister won't let it go forward. But in a situation where his priority is an immunity law that will protect him from indictments, when one of the parties that has to make up your government has at the top of their list a demand that annexation begin, I think that we would be foolish to not take that seriously.
Right. I think you have the combination of the mainstreaming of the discourse of annexation being brought into something that is considered completely politically acceptable today, on top of Netanyahu's legal challenges, which have all of the incentives to seek immunity legislation and to do whatever politically necessary to ensure that that's advanced. And we saw that, as you said, Michael, with the merger of the Jewish home with the Jewish Power Party, the same sort of political considerations that drove Netanyahu to seek political survival in encouraging that deal could come to play in annexation. I think we've heard a lot of talk in recent weeks privately by some Israelis who think that all of the talk of annexation is merely an election ploy to move the right. And I would hope they are right, but I think the stakes are so high that we cannot take that for granted. And certainly this may be a scenario where Netanyahu himself, he is someone who has traditionally been very cautious about making broad moves on the West Bank, has really sought to ensure the status quo, including his political staying power. But here's a situation where even if Netanyahu really wants to go slow, he may find himself dragged in the process of annexation because of the way in which it's been advanced in the political discourse and the demands of forming a coalition that would advance immunity, which really makes us take another look at what wider scale annexation would mean. Certainly, this is a map that was based on the position adopted by the Likud Central Committee a year ago, which was essentially leads to ending the concept of Palestinian-Israeli territorial contiguity and annexing Area C, which of course includes considerable portions of private Palestinian land. And we could take another look at annexing Area C. You can see on the map on the right, it's the map that we've started with, removing Area A and B, or I'm sorry, sort of removing the delineation of C. So now C is essentially incorporated into Israel. And you can see what the map looks like and the enormous questions that emerge in terms of how do you ensure Israeli-Palestinian contiguity without any enormous amounts of infrastructure being created to ensure transportation flows, security, and otherwise.
Right, and just just to make sure that everybody understands kind of what you're looking at when you see this map. So, as David points out, right, it's about, first of all, think about ensuring Palestinian just movement around in Palestinian areas. When they have to traverse when they have to traverse all the tan areas on that map in between the islands of green, but also keep in mind that if everything on that map that is not green is Israel, you have to build a border around all of those, every single green area there, the big ones and every single tiny little green dot. And that means 169 new border fences. And when we talk about the need for Israel to develop and maintain defensible borders, this would literally be the least defensible border in the history of human civilization. And again, this is the most popular of the annexation plans. This is the one that has the most support from folks who advocate annexation. It's annexing Area C. And this map is what that looks like, annexing Area C. These are what Israel's borders would be. It's something that's almost impossible to carry out in any type of practicality. But this is what people on the Israeli right, when they say let's annex Area C, this is what they're talking about.
Right. And what this is essentially the process that we're so concerned about. The absorption of Area C, the creation of those 169 islands that we just saw. And what we're most concerned about is what the trigger effect might be. That would, of course, lead to the collapse of the PA, the potential breakout of violence, and the forcing of Israel to reoccupy areas A and B, leading to the only conversation at that point, which would be a binational state. And in the Commanders for Israel Security Research, they've created this sort of diagram of what a slippery slope could look like, which we want to share with you here. One moment. There it is.
Right, and what the basic kind of argument here, if you kind of follow the arrows on this map, is that once you start with partial annexation, you move along to annexation of Area C, and at that point, when you annex 60% of the West Bank and divided the rest of it into 169 different enclaves, and you say to the Palestinians, you can have autonomy in 40% of the West Bank that contains these 169 enclaves, but you're never going to get a state. The notion that the PA, which was created to eventually get to this notion of Palestinian statehood, the notion that the PA can survive that, or frankly will be willing to survive that and to cooperate with the Israelis on security and be willing to administer that non-contiguous 40% of the West Bank. I think that I personally think it's fantasy, but certainly even if you think that it's not fantasy, you got to take the risk of the PA collapsing in that scenario extremely seriously. And once that happens, I always think of the Colin Powell admonition before the Iraq War. If you break it, you bought it. At that point, if the PA dissolves, Israel owns the entire West Bank, right? Israel has to then be the governing authority for the entirety of it and all 2.5 million Palestinians there, and actually deal with policing and administering and governing every single Palestinian city, town, and village. And what that means is an effective annexation of the entire West Bank and an absorption of every single Palestinian living there. And then we get to this fundamental question about what type of state is Israel going to be? Is it going to be one that gives citizenship willingly to the 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank? I find that scenario very hard to imagine. I think it more likely is essentially a permanent occupation, and without giving the Palestinians full rights or citizenship. And at that point, we have we're talking about the dreaded A word that people don't like to use, but at that point you are absolutely talking about an apartheid regime. And when we can talk about the implications of that for Israel on the international stage and the U.S.-Israel relationship, but I think that we also need to seriously think about the implications of that for American Jewry and what that means for us and what that means for our support for Israel. Our support for Israel, and what it looks like to be pro-Israel American Jews defending an Israel that is frankly doing things that are indefensible. And I don't by any means think that this is a point that Israel or the Israeli government wants to get to. I think the problem is that once you go down this road, it's very hard to stop it getting to that point. Which is why it's so important to try to do everything we can to make sure that these first steps don't happen. Because once these first steps of partial annexation happen, we're quickly going to get to that point at the end of this path, where we have one state, and that one state either looks like it's not democratic or it looks like it's not Jewish, but it's not going to be both.
Right, and I'll just add that there is no certainty with this path in terms of what will be what's listed here as the ignition point. In other words, it's possible that we would see partial annexation and that initially the sky might not fall, which would be further incentive to continue on to the next path and further incentive to continue further and further and further. However, I think there's one important point, which is that every step that's taking is bringing us closer and closer to that ignition point, and every step that is to be taken is increasing the chances that we'll not only reach that ignition point, but it's increasing the uncertainty of what comes next. There is no certainty of what the straw will be that breaks the camel's back and leads to the collapse of the PA, but there is certainty that advancing annexation is only going to make that increase in its possibility. It's certainly not going to decrease the chance that the PA is going to collapse. It's certainly not going to decrease the pressure that would mount from the BDS movement, or international isolation is not going to decrease the tension between American Jews or partisanship around Israel. It will only lead us to these potential ignition points that could lead to deeply, whether it's violent outcomes, we don't know, but it raises the stakes of uncertainty, and it raises the stakes for Israel's future by taking these sorts of unilateral steps. And we might add that the whole opposition that the American Jewish community, and that ourselves included, have had to Palestinians seeking various efforts in the international arena was that it was done in a unilateral fashion. I think taking such unilateral steps removes any hesitance that we might see on unilateral actions of all kinds. Once the entire framework that is governing has governed the areas A, B, and C process for the last 20 plus years, is unilaterally altered in such a way, the uncertainties of what is to follow are very significant and potentially dangerous, as we see with this path that would lead us to a one-state reality. And here is essentially the one-state reality as outlined, not including the Gaza Strip, showing that essentially 37% of the population between the river and the sea, not including Gaza overnight. And I think what you see on the map on the right is where the demographic majority lies. In the West Bank, as you see in red, is predominantly a Palestinian Arab majority in the West Bank, where we still see a broad demographic parity between areas that would likely be slated for a future Palestinian state and areas slated for Israel. When we talk about the impact of annexation, we talk about the various ramifications. There are security, diplomatic, economic, social, and legal. We're going to just touch on a few of them in this process to introduce these ideas. I would encourage you all to visit our website, israelpolicyforum.org/annexation, to download the full report, and israelpolicyforum.org/annexation watch to see more videos and more various resources that we've put together on all of these various issues. Starting with security. We've already talked a bit about the potential for renewed violence, for the potential need for IDF to come back into areas A and B. Michael, I wonder if you'd talk a little bit, because I did see we had a question, and I know we have a number of questions coming in, but I wonder if you could speak directly about Egypt and Jordan and the fallout of annexation impacting those relationships.
Yeah, so I think in those situations, it's probably different. I think that Egypt obviously does not want to see any Israeli annexation, but it doesn't impact the Egyptians as much as it does the Jordanians. If Israel annexes the West Bank, it's going to be impossible for Jordan to continue its cooperation and its relationship with Israel. It will put the Jordanian monarchy at risk. And if there is one party that has been warning anybody who will listen about the risks of annexation, it has been the Jordanian government. And so when you talk to IDF folks, they always talk about Israel's eastern security border really being the border between Jordan and Iraq, because of this robust security cooperation with Jordan and the fact that Jordan is seen as basically a bulwark against hostility coming from Israel's east, that will be gone. It's going to be impossible to maintain that if there is West Bank annexation. And to briefly talk about the Palestinian Authority, the security cooperation between the IDF and the PA is incredible. It's robust. It's ongoing, literally 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The reason it is the number one reason that there is no more mass organized terrorism inside of Israeli cities. And if you go through with West Bank annexation, you're putting the PA at risk, and you're putting that security coordination at risk. And it doesn't only mean a threat from outside Israel's borders. It means a real renewed threat of terrorism, like we saw during the Second Intifada. And I don't think that's anything that anybody wants to see either.
I think that's right. And just to underscore on the Jordanian front, I think the return, the consistent return to the refrain that the future Palestinian state is in Jordan is so deeply irresponsible to think that you will take Israel's one of two Arab states that have made peace with Israel, that coordinate deeply with Israel, that is a major ally of the United States in fighting terrorism on the doorstep of the chaos in Syria and alongside Iraq, with flooded with refugees, Palestinian, Iraqi, now Syrian refugees, to essentially promote regime change and hope the situation works out, is so incredibly irresponsible. And yet we see it time and time again entering the political discourse. Economic. We see a number of issues that will impact Israel's economy, essentially the process of needing to provide for 2.6 million Palestinians in the West Bank when it comes to education, health care, and social welfare benefits, and of course, the considerable increases in the defense budget to create the kind of system of fencing and checkpoints, as well as additional battalions and so forth to patrol areas A and B. According to the research by the Commanders for Israel Security, we're talking about close to $15 billion per year. And here's a report that I'll play briefly that appeared on Channel 12 about the economic issue in particular. Sorry about that.
בשנים האחרונות גוברים הקולות בימין, גם בתוך הקואליציה, לסיפוח מלא או חלקי של השטחים. עכשיו דוח חדש של ארגון בשם מפקדים למען ביטחון ישראל, שגם מוביל קמפיין מתגרשים מהפלסטינים, מגיש את החשבון. כמה יעלה סיפוח או עד חמו? אתה עם הנתונים הערב, אוהד.
כן, יונית, אם כך תזכורת. שטחי יהודה ושומרון מחולקים לשלושה. שטחי A בשליטה פלסטינית, כאן באדום. בשטחי B השליטה כמובן משותפת, וכל השאר הוא שטח C, 60% מהגדה, בשליטה צבאית ואזרחית של ישראל. אם ישראל, יונית, תספח את שטחי C, על פי תוכנית בנט, קרי החלת הריבונות, 66,000 פלסטינים שמתגוררים שם יהפכו לתושבים ישראלים. גדר ההפרדה שנבנתה כבר לא תהיה רלוונטית. אם רוצים לבנות גדר הפרדה חדשה על גבול שטחי C, היא תסתרע על, שימי לב, 1,787 קילומטרים, בעלות של 27 מיליארד שקלים. אלא שכבר היום נשמעים קולות בפתח ובתנזים, הגוף החמוש הגדול ביותר בשטחים, שמצהירים נאבק בסיפוח בכל אמצעי. תנועת מפקדים למען ביטחון ישראל, שמקדמת היפרדות מהפלסטינים, צריך לומר, וכוללת ראשי מוסד ושב"כ, את הקצונה הבכירה ביותר לשעבר בצה"ל, ערכה מחקר שמעריך מה יקרה אם תוכנית הסיפוח תיושם. על פי המחקר, אם ישראל תספח את שטחי C, סביר שיתפתח עימות מזוין עם הרשות הפלסטינית, שעלול להיגרר למעין חומת מגן. לדבריהם, אגב, הרשות עלולה להתפרק, וישראל תיאלץ אולי לשוב ולכבוש את יתר השטח. במספרים, שליטה בעוד 2.6 מיליון פלסטינים. אז כמה כל זה יעלה לנו? אותו מחקר בודק כמה יעלה תסריט הבלהות הזה, ומי שכתבו אותו בין היתר הם 3 מנכ"לי משרד האוצר לשעבר, דוד ברודט, ירום אריאב ופרופסור אבי בן בסט, ואלה המספרים. מענקי לידה ואשפוז לנשים הרות, כולל קצבאות ילדים, יעלו יותר מ5 מיליארד שקלים. ואחרי הלידה, מסגרות חינוך. שכר למורים, בניית בתי ספר ופיתוחם, יעלו 14.6 מיליארד. גם מערכת בריאות שלמה, מהיסוד, מקופות החולים ועד אשפוזים, יעלו יותר מ16 מיליארד שקלים. נמשיך. אם זה נשמע לכם הרבה, שימו לב לקצבאות ביטוח לאומי והבטחת הכנסה, כמעט 21 מיליארד שקלים. יחד עם השלמות הכנסה, קצבאות זקנה, שירותי רווחה ועוד, שיעלו 10 מיליארד שקלים, ומינוס ההכנסות הצפויות, מסקנתם היא כי עלות הסיפוח תהיה 52 מיליארד שקלים בשנה, כל שנה, או במילים אחרות 25,742 שקלים לכל משפחה. יונית, זה ללא ספק תרחיש הקצה, אבל כמעט לכל הדעות, לכל מהלך של סיפוח יהיה מחיר כלכלי כבד, ועוד לא אמרנו מילה על המחיר הביטחוני האפשרי.
רק המחיר הכלכלי. תודה רבה, אוהד.
So that lays it out quite clearly. And of course, there's diplomatic. And this is what really, Michael, you were touching on before about where it puts us in the American Jewish community and advocates for Israel, not only facing questions about the real desire to see any future agreement, an agreement being the operative word, but this serving to really fuel efforts to isolate Israel. And what's not listed here on the diplomatic front are the two issues that are concerning to us greatly in this moment, which is the growing partisanship and the growing divide between Israel and American Jews. If you have to add here.
Right. So, on the issue of partisanship, Democrats in Congress have recently been very vocal on their support for two states, on their opposition to annexation. On the other side of that, the Trump administration has multiple times declined to state any position on two states or on annexation. But there have been reports that I think are probably credible that the Trump administration peace plan is going to extend Israeli sovereignty to all of the settlements. If Israel does this, as much as there has already been a partisan split on Israel that has emerged and is getting worse, almost by the day, I think this is going to make it really a permanent one, because when you have something that is so divisive, and one party says we're fine with it, and the other party says this is a red line for us, then I don't know how you maintain any type of real bipartisan cooperation or consensus on Israel. And it's not going to be limited to diplomatic issues. It's going to eventually extend to support for measures that safeguard Israel's security. And to move to quickly talk about BDS. BDS has been a remarkably failed movement in many ways, in that there are no corporations that have signed on to the BDS movement. There are no university boards that have signed on to the BDS movement. If Israel goes ahead and annexes the West Bank and forecloses the possibility of a Palestinian state permanently, it's literally the one thing you could do to provide the biggest boost and the most support to the BDS movement. And as American Jews, when we talk about BDS being such a big threat, something we have to combat, I literally can't think of anything that will make it harder to combat that. And so, if we're gonna talk about combating BDS seriously, we're gonna take it as a serious issue, then frankly, I don't know how you divorce it from opposing annexation.
That's right. We have a lot of questions, and we only have about 10 minutes, and I think we've touched on most of the critical issues. When we talk about in conclusion about how the fragility of the current situation, the momentum that annexation currently has, the concern that partial annexation cannot be contained, the bipartisanship, and ultimately the one-state reality. But we have a number of questions, Michael, which I think we should address. And one of them comes back to this issue of partial annexation, which is, how do we really know that it will be, that it won't be able to just stop there? I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to this point of how it opens up concerns of unilateral steps on the other side. And I would encourage all of those who are concerned about the issue of partial annexation to read Michael Koplow's column from just 1 week ago that touched on this issue considerably. But Michael, maybe if you have another word on that point.
Yeah, so, it also goes to the question of, whether this annexation talk is just an election tactic, or whether, there are serious plans to go ahead. It's important to understand that partial annexation is not a position that anybody on the Israeli right takes. There is no support for partial annexation. The support is for, when I say partial, I mean, Mala Adumim, or just the big blocks. There is support for partial annexation as a first step toward eventual full Area C or the entirety of the West Bank, right? I actually am hard-pressed to think of even one Israeli politician who has come out, I don't know if there's one, who has come out in support of partial annexation, qua partial annexation, and that's where it stops. So that's not what anybody's interested in. If that were the plan, then we could have a different discussion about it. But nobody's talking about that. Second, even if people were talking about that, you still are left with the fact that there will be a Palestinian Authority response. And when we look at what the PA has been doing just over the last couple of months, and I wrote about this last week, with regard to not to go too deep into the weeds, but the Israeli Knesset passed a law that was implemented in February, where they have been deducting from the tax revenues that they collect on the PA's behalf and transfer to the PA. They've been deducting from those revenues the amount of money that Israel has determined that the PA pays to terrorists and the families of dead terrorists, the martyrs fund, as it's colloquially known. Israel has been deducting that amount and trying to then pass the rest of the revenues onto the PA. And the PA said, we're either going to take all or nothing. And Israel said, we think you're bluffing. And they passed this law, and they've now 2 months in a row directly deposited into PA bank accounts the reduced tax revenues. And both times the PA has returned every single shekel of that money. In other words, the PA is holding fast to this position that they will take all the tax revenues or they will take none of it. I think that when the PA said that it cannot and will not survive in the event of annexation, and that it will dissolve and Israel will be left holding the entire West Bank, in light of what the PA has been doing recently with regards to tax revenues, I think we should all be taking that seriously. And the fact that Netanyahu wants to avoid an indictment more than anything else, and that annexation is one way for him to avoid an indictment, I think means that we shouldn't be looking at this as just an electoral tactic or empty campaign rhetoric. I think that he is going to go through with the first steps toward partial annexation. And again, if that happens and the PA follows through on its threats, at that point, it really doesn't matter what Israel wants. It doesn't matter whether Israel wants the annexation to be partial or to be full. It will end up with a full annexation, whether it likes it or not. And I think that that's where that's where we're getting into this very dangerous territory.
Agreed. I know there's a lot of questions about whether this is being recorded. It is recorded, and we will be sending it out to everyone who signed up to the call, but it will also be on our website at israelpolicyforum.org and featured on our special campaign site, israelpolicyforum.org /annexation watch. On that site, again, you will see a variety of videos from the Israeli media, new videos that we've created with various resources, and there will be more features that we're going to be sharing in the weeks to come, because it really is a critical period as the new coalition government is formed in the coming weeks, and all of these decisions ultimately being made. I think that Julian Lederman asked a question, Michael, that I think we should address, which is that the U.S. has declined to take a position against annexation. I think this was most notable when Secretary of State Pompeo was asked by Senator Van Hollen in a public hearing just a couple of weeks ago whether he had a position on this issue, and he declined to take one. But Julian asked why we haven't heard from other Western governments on this front, and I'm not sure we haven't, by the way.
Yeah, so the EU governments are on the record as opposing it, and Jordan has been, the Jordanian government has been extremely vocal publicly, but even more so privately in DC about the risk of annexation. When it comes to the Saudis and the Egyptians, from what we've heard privately and from behind the scenes conversations, they are absolutely opposed to it. And King Salman in the past few months has publicly reiterated his position that any resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has to be based on a two-state solution that starts with the 1967 borders. But I also think that, particularly with the Saudis, they don't want to run afoul of the Trump administration. And so they haven't been very vocal about it, but they're also relying on the fact that the Palestinians are going to raise complete hell. And that once that happens, it then sort of gives cover to the Saudis in particular to publicly oppose it. But, I don't think it's accurate to say that there's been silence from everyone. The Jordanians have not been silent, and the EU has not been silent. And I think that the Saudis and the Egyptians, again, because these are the two countries that have had the closest ties with the Trump administration, I think they're hoping that they won't have to say anything until the very last moment. I think they're sort of hoping that this actually goes away, but they're not going to get out in front of it. But believe me, anybody who thinks that the Saudis or the Egyptians are going to somehow support annexation of the West Bank, I would respectfully submit have never had a conversation with either an Egyptian or a Saudi.
Right. So I know we've seen some comments about to what extent is this information being spread in Israel, and this is really the work of the Commanders for Israel Security to take this message to the Israeli public and to Israeli policymakers. And our concern is really creating awareness within the American Jewish community and Washington policymakers about the importance of doing all we can to preserve the two-state solution, the two-state concept, as the path to ensure a secure Jewish and democratic Israel. And Michael, one of the questions was, what can we as American Jews do about all of this? And I think the first thing is to start talking about it. Start asking Israelis about it. Start asking questions about it. You can go to our Annexation Watch site and actually download a fact sheet of questions for when you're interacting with Israelis to simply ask questions about where this is headed. And frankly, I think that it's incredibly important for those of us who deeply care about the future of the state of Israel, its relationship with the United States, its relationship with American Jews, to be able to express our deep concerns about this and to prepare for it as a possibility. I think the notion that we will be effective in making a credible case for the strength of the U.S.-Israel alliance if we do not express concern about what this could do to the concept of two states and the U.S.-Israel relationship, our credibility as advocates will be diminished. And I think what we need to do is educate ourselves, ask questions, and prepare ourselves to persevere through the moment that we are in now to uphold the concept of a secure Jewish and democratic Israel. And I think for us, this is a critical moment in the story of Israel and the decisions that may be made in the short years to come. And ultimately, we are part of that story, and we should be educating ourselves, others, asking questions, and preparing policymakers to ensure that we stay with this notion of a secure Jewish and democratic Israel. I think the worst scenario here is if we actually saw annexation applauded by many in the community. And I think it's critical that our community recognize that this does not have positive outcomes. It only creates greater uncertainty and greater challenges, not only for Israel itself, but for our role as advocates for Israel in the United States. Michael, I wonder if you have anything to add.
Yeah, actually, that's a great last word, and so I hate to do anything to add to it, but I will add one last thing, which is that the reason that we talk about a special U.S.-Israel relationship, the reason that the U.S.-Israel relationship and support for Israel and the United States is fundamentally different than, let's say, the U.S.-Saudi relationship or the U.S.-Turkey relationship, or relationships that we have with other strong defense and military allies across the globe and in the Middle East, is because of this idea of shared values and ideological affinity between the United States and Israel. Yes, Israel is strategically important, and it always will be. And there will always be support for Israel's security and a robust U.S.-Israel relationship based on security ties. But what takes it to that next level, when we talk about this unbreakable bond between the U.S. and Israel, it is this notion of shared values. And annexation threatens that entirely. It threatens the U.S.-Israel relationship in that way. It threatens widespread support for Israel among Americans. And it certainly threatens within the American Jewish community this idea and this vision that we have of Israel as being a beacon of justice and as being the only democracy in the Middle East and as being a place that is a reflection of our American democratic, pluralistic, liberal values. That is all at risk with annexation. And you know, I know that this entire briefing has been, you know, it's a dire one, and it sounds alarmist, but I really can't express enough what a dangerous situation we find ourselves in, and we are really on the cusp of a disaster. And I think that for anybody who cares about Israel and anybody who cares about the U.S.-Israel relationship, you have to educate yourself on these issues and really make clear to American policymakers and to our own community leaders and to Israelis that this is something that we do not want to see happen and that we will not support. So
we're at the hour. I know there are a couple questions we didn't get to, but I'm going to encourage everyone to once again visit us at israelpolicyforum.org/annexationwatch. We will have additional resources and I believe some webinars upcoming as well. I also encourage everyone to check out our podcast, where we will have some more deep dive conversations about these issues at Israel Policy Pod, which you can download wherever you get your podcasts. If you're not already subscribing to receive Michael's weekly column, then you are most certainly doing it wrong, and you most certainly should be subscribing to receive all of our materials. Once again, we'll post this video online, and we'll have much more to share in the days ahead as we focus on this critical issue leading up to early June. And Michael, somehow we just lasted a full hour without talking about the Trump peace plan, which is
that'll be next time.
That'll have to be next time. But I want to thank everyone for joining and for your attention. And I look forward to you all joining us once again as we talk about these critically important issues. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, David.